We're going to be looking at some sound design today. So I've made a bunch of basses for you guys and just laid down a simple drum beat. Sounds a little bit like this. I haven't really done too much mixing this time. This is more just to show the sound design process. So I haven't done a lot of processing on these basses either. Mainly it's just got some EQ, maybe some compression and saturation, and that's just, oh, maybe some reverb as well on the sounds. I've got about 5 here, so I'm going to just go through them quickly and basically just show you little tips and tricks along the way of like how I go about doing them. So this first one is a 2-layer stab. So you can hear we got the high layer, and then we got the low layer. So the low layer is interesting because this is a really punchy sound, but it's not that complicated. We got a sine wave here, so essentially on envelope 1, we got the volume dropping down, so it sort of makes an 808 sort of shape. Envelope 2, we've got this very quick transient shape here, and that you can see is affecting the master tune. So I've got that going up 24 semitones, so I typed in 24 ST there. And essentially that's just dropping the pitch of the sound down at the very start, which creates this almost little drum pop thing. It's a transient or a punchy sort of sound. And then I've got envelope 3 here, which is, it has a longer decay and a higher sustain here, and that's affecting the drive and the cutoff of the filter. So you can see at the start, it boosts the drive and the cutoff way up, and then that sort of drops back down. For effects, not too much. I've got compression, just boosted the gain up a bit. It's not on multiband. And then some distortion, I just got a little bit of soft clip on 33%. Now, for the high layer, this one's a little bit more complicated. So I'll turn off all of these effects. Now, if we go in here, basically what I did is once I'd made that bass patch, I duplicated it. So I came in, so a lot of the things are the same. So envelope 1, 2, and 3 are the same. Oscillator A is the same. The filter is the same. But what I've done now is I've activated oscillator B. So the filter's also affecting oscillator B here, you'll see. Now oscillator B is just a higher order sound. You can see I've boosted the octave up by 3 and the semitones by 7. And essentially it's just, I went to the wavetable editor here, and usually what I'll do is I'll go down singles and sine, and that creates something like this, and then I just drew in 2 more bins, and that created a little bit more tonal variation than just having a sine wave. Now that plus obviously the octave and semitones, it makes it much higher up, but it still has the same sort of punch and character and shape as the bass because I kept the envelopes and the filters the same. Now keep in mind, this is what it would sound like on its own. But because I have oscillator A still activated, which is still down in the sub notes, this is what's causing grit. Now keep in mind, the note I've got here is E0. So I always write stuff in 0, like between C0 and C1, because then that means that the fundamental frequency is in the sub-region. Going into the effects, I've essentially got some hyperdimension, which is just giving it width. I've got compressor on. Again, no multiband, just a bit of gain. I've got an EQ here. Now what that's doing is I'm taking out the sub because that's being handled by the sub layer there. And I'm also boosting up the frequency, the fundamental frequency, to give that a bit more push. And then after that, I'm driving it into a distortion here, just an asymmetrical with a little bit of drive. Phasers on, I've got the rate, depth, and frequency all at 0, and then the mix up a little bit. That just gives it a little bit more of a guitar amp sound. Doesn't do too much. Chorus, just giving it a bit of width. Delay, a little bit more variation, not too much happening there. And then the last one is a little bit of reverb filter. So these last four, they're affecting it a little bit, but I don't really want to like go into them because they're not doing too much for the sound. Now you put those together, and then on top of that, in our post-processing, for the high layer only, so you'll see it's only on this chain, I've got some reverb. So essentially what I've done is I've done parallel reverb here. So I have one chain where the dry sound is going through, and then I duplicated that. So Command D, duplicate. And what that's doing is added another chain, and on that I've put a hybrid reverb, and I've made that 100%. So this is 100% reverb. This has no reverb. And then you just mix in the reverb, just drop down and mix in the decibels here until you get it to a level that you want. Now, after that, I've got some kilohertz plugins. Essentially, I've just got a comb filter and a ring mod. They aren't doing too much to the sound. They're not necessary, but I have them and I sort of know what they can do there. So if you have them, it just adds a little bit of tonal difference to the sound, but they're not really necessary. After that, I've got a saturator boosting the sound up by about 4.57 or 5 dB. And then I've got a kilohertz transient shaper just creating a little bit more punch at the start. But again, the kilohertz stuff isn't necessary. You could have just gotten away with the saturator there and the reverb back over here. So that's essentially the first sound. And we'll move on to the second sound now, which is the wamp. Now this is a really simple sound. There's no post-processing. Essentially what I've done is I've got, again, this one sitting at same note on the MIDI, E0. And what it is two sine waves. Now I have one sitting on the root note, which is, there's no change to the octave or semitones here. And I've got 3 voices with the blend turned up a little bit so the middle one is a bit more prominent so that it has a little bit more mono compatibility. And this one is being FM'd by a sine wave on oscillator B, which is boosted at 2 octaves and 7 semitones up. Now the random's turned down on this because I just have a singular note there and I don't want that one to be changing too much between each hit of the note. And then you can see here I've got LFO1 automating the FM amount from about 23% up by about 25. And I've got this sort of basic shape here. That LFO is also affecting the low pass filter. And then in the effects, I've got a bit of tape saturation. A little bit of grit it's adding, not too much. I got the compressor on. Again, nothing changed, just boosted the gain. Didn't turn on the multiband. I've then cleaned the sound up by putting this LFO on another low pass filter, MG Low 24. And then the last one, which is where the sound comes to life, is the reverb. Now, interestingly, what I've done here is I've taken this LFO shape and I've put it on the mix, but I've inverted it. So essentially, if I was to do it like this, which is what you'd normally do, as this LFO shape goes up, so would the reverb increase. But what I've actually done is I've inverted it so that as this goes up, this will go down. And essentially what happens is when the sound hits its peak, it's actually very dry, but then as it tapers off here towards the end, the reverb starts increasing. And you can hear it sort of rings out, so that when it goes back down to the bottom here at the end, the reverb's actually at its fullest. So that's the wamp sound. And I apologize for my phone bloody going off. So this third sound here, this is getting a little bit more gritty. So this is sort of like a stabby sort of sound. So essentially what I've done with this one is I've taken a sine wave and I've sort of just drawn in the bins here to create some sort of weird shape. It's almost like it's a sine wave, but it's got a lot more weird fundamental or weird harmonics in it, as you can see. And then I've also boosted up the octave and the semitones by +2 and +12. So actually, the +12, that's just another octave. So this is the same if it's +3. So it's just 3 octaves up. Now, essentially, I've got this LFO1 here. And then I've also got the envelope. But these ones originally I had on the sound. But what I decided to do later on, and this is also another thing that you can remember, is that you don't always have to have the movement of your sound affected by the LFOs or the envelopes. So I started with those. But later on I said, okay, I actually want the macro to affect everything. So the macro is affecting the level of oscillator B. It's affecting the cutoff, the resonance, and the drive of the filter. So essentially, as this goes up, the cutoff, so I'll put that back on. You can see it's driving up, it's filtering up, as in the cutoff's going up, and the resonance is going up. And I found a little sweet spot where these are all dialed in so that the top of those points, what actually happens is where that resonance peaks up at the top is actually a fundamental tone of this shape here. So what happens is when it hits that point, it's actually accentuating a tone that's already there. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we put on the master, actually no, I'll leave it off the master. I'll go on here and I'll chuck on span. When I say a fundamental frequency, I'm either usually talking about the sub or I'm talking about the main resonant frequency of the further up sound, like the leady sound. So in this case, we're talking at about 350 hertz here. Now, essentially what happens is as this maxes out on this macro, you'll notice that the cutoff and the resonance, it peaks at about 350. So it's taking that resonant peak that was already there and it's almost accentuating it. Now, essentially what happens then is that this whole oscillator B and the filter, they create almost this tonal sound that's up at that tonal frequency here. And then to pair with that, we've got the sub. So you see we add the sub in there. Now, the magic happens when we distort the sub together with the tonal frequency. So without, it sounds like that. But then we add a shitload of tube distortion and that sub and the tonal frequency further up, they mix together and create this gritty tonal sound. After that, I've got a multiband compressor on, which has just got a lot of gain and it's got the multiband turned on. I've got some hyper dimension, which is adding a little bit of width. I did have the reverb, but that's actually turned fully down, so that doesn't need to be there. I've got a bit of chorus going on. So also as the macro hits the top, the chorus mix comes in more, so it gets wider. And then I've got a low pass filter here. So essentially that's just cleaning it up again. You'll notice in a lot of my sounds, I'll have a filter at the end because it'll be quite in your face by the time you've added all this processing on, and then you want to add a filter on at the end that just brings it back underneath that LFO shape that you wanted, or in this case, the macro that I'm using. Now what I've done is because everything's assigned to that macro that shapes the sound, I've then been able to draw in the shape that I want. And you can see here that I can sort of shape it and do different things as it goes on, and that creates a little bit of variation. So I haven't just taken this first initial shape here and copied it over. You can see as it goes further on, it starts to get a little bit further up and a little bit more sustained. And that sort of makes it, it gives it this essence of like getting bigger as you go along. Now after that, same thing. I've got some reverb here, parallel reverb. So essentially dry chain and then a reverb only chain on 100% dry wet. Then after that, I've got an EQ, which is just basically mixing. So for this sound, I noticed that that frequency that was in the middle, that was very prevalent, but that the bass, the sub wasn't actually coming through too well. And I also noticed that it sounded a bit muffled. There wasn't a lot of highs. So what I've done is I've increased the bass up, the sub. I've dropped down that fundamental frequency. And then I've given a boost to the super highs. So essentially we've got more clarity from the highs. We've got more sub presence. And then we've got a reduced fundamental tonal frequency there. After that, I've just got a saturator to cap it off at 0. And then, yeah, just the span here for us analyzing. So that's the third sound. We then get to the response. So I'll take off all of these effects. These two I wasn't using, so I don't need those. Now you can see there that the sound has changed quite a lot. The reason for that is, I'll get into it, but essentially this saturator I'm using instead of distortion. So this sounds actually quite simple when you get into it. We've essentially, and again, the MIDI is on the same note, E0. Essentially we've got a sub. I've then got a sine wave on here, and what I've done is I put it on basic shapes and on sine, and then I went into the wavetable editor and took the bin down over here, and I've raised it up on bin 12. And then on oscillator B, I've done the same. I've raised it up on bin 12. So when we come back in, essentially what we have here is that you have this long LFO1 on 2 bars that's affecting the level of both oscillators. And then we have oscillator 2, which is giving it its shape. So if oscillator 2 wasn't affecting it, it would sound like this. But we have the second oscillator that's affecting the drive of the filter, and that's driving the sound up as we go along. Now you hear that there's a pause at the start, because basically what I did with LFO1 is that I bring the level up over the first like bar or two, or the first few notes. Now what I wanted to do is that I only wanted this LFO shape, the wobble thing, to start affecting it once it hit this point. So I actually went on to the second one and I increased the delay here. The delay essentially stops the LFO from affecting whatever it's affecting for the time that you set there. So I've got a half bar set there. So it holds off for that and then it starts going. Then on the filter, I've just chosen a combs from the miscellaneous section, and cutoff and resonance are both down. I'm literally just affecting the drive here. So without the drive, you can see that essentially we're just driving the sound up, specifically A and B, because this filter isn't affecting the sub. We're driving that sound up, so essentially we're driving this fundamental tonal frequency, which if we open up a span, I'll drop this on here. Sorry, not that one. We open up a span. You can see that the sound is actually very simple. That's sub note is just this one. And then this up here, essentially this bin up here is what you're seeing over at this side. Again, it's just two sine waves, one at the sub frequency and then one quite a few harmonics further up. Now in the effects, all we've got is I'm boosting up the sub, so about 100 and something hertz. I'm boosting the gain up of that by this same wobble LFO. And that's just essentially boosting the sub up because I felt like there wasn't enough push of the sub every time that LFO comes in. Now, that's a pretty meek sort of sound. We've just got the sub and then the tone, but then once you apply a shitload of saturation on, suddenly becomes a lot more gritty. Following on from that, I've just got some multiband compression with the output boosted up. And then I have reverb. And then I have some EQ where I'm boosting up the highs. I'm taking off some of the super highs because I found there was some resonant frequencies up there I didn't like. And I'm just giving the sub a bit of a boost. And then yeah, that's it. We just got the span. So you can see without the saturator and with. And then the last but not least is this response sound over here. So this is a bit more of a sustained sound. Now this is a bit more of a weird patch. Again, I've got the sub on here and I've got oscillator B. It's just a saw wave up 2 octaves and 7 semitones. But that's not really doing too much. In fact, it looks like I didn't even turn that oscillator B on. So I'll turn that off. So essentially we've just got the sub and then oscillator A. And basically what I'm doing is instead of having oscillator B with the volume coming out, I'm actually just using that as an FM. So oscillator A is getting FM'd from oscillator B. But what I've done here is I've actually dropped the octave down by 4. Now that's weird because usually if I'd left that on 0, it'd sound like this. But what I did was I just did some random experimentation. And I found that dropping it down by 4, it sort of gives it this weird effect. So try weird stuff like that. Sometimes it can turn out and be really good. This LFO shape here is affecting the drive and the cutoff, so it's just boosting up the drive and the cutoff. But since I have that at full there, originally I had it like this. You can see it's just saying sustained. And then I've got a resonant peak here that's sort of just boosting up some of the mid frequencies. I then got some hyperdimension again to give it some width, some chorus giving it width. I've got a low pass filter. Again, LFO 1 is affecting the cutoff and the drive. But at the moment I just have it fully up, so that just means that the filter and the drive are all the way up. Well, not the drive's up at about 65 in that case. And then after that I've got a compressor with some multiband. And then yeah, put them all together. Now again, by my standards, that isn't a riff that I would probably use too much, but this is more just a bunch of different basses and styles that I wanted to show you. So I hope you guys have gotten some good info out of this sound design tutorial, and if there's new ones that you want me to do, let me know, and if there's different ways that you want me to go through them, let me know. Anyway, peace out.